Hi, this is Greg Kilstrom. Welcome to Season 3 of the Agile World, where we discuss customer and employee experience, organizational and workforce transformation, and how business can adapt and continually improve in an agile age. The Agile World podcast is brought to you by TEKsystems, an industry leader in full-stack technology services, talent services, and real-world application. For more information, go to teksystems.com. To read more about the topics discussed in this show, you can go to my website at theagile.world and read my latest articles, or get a copy of my latest book, The Agile Workforce, now available on Amazon and other retailers. My name is Greg Kilstrom, and I'm the host of the Agile World podcast. Today we're going to talk about the gap between leadership, HR, and DevOps in many organizations, and how aligning them can bring better results to both the individuals within the organization, as well as the success of the organization as a whole. To help me discuss this topic, I'd like to welcome Duena Blomstrom, co-founder and CEO of People Not Tech, and author of the book People Before Tech, to her second time on the show. Duena, welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, looking forward to talking again. So let's get started by talking about this disconnect that I mentioned before, this disconnect between leadership, HR, and DevOps. How about if you start by describing it for us? What are some of the challenges?
Oh yes, where to start? Gosh, haven't we dove right in? Let me try. So, a little bit of history of how I ended up stumbling on this issue in itself is I was in what I would say was a completely different industry, although is there really ever a different industry than people and agile? And when I started focusing solely on agile, really, and on the way the teams need to be enabled to function in agile, it was because I had arrived at this concept which was getting me all up in arms, called the human debt, which is, as I explain in some of my articles, essentially the human equivalent of the technical debt. Which we're all familiar with if we've ever written a line of code or worked in a technology environment. Anytime you cut any corners, anytime that you know you've made the wrong decisions from an architectural point of view, all of those things accumulate over time and they create technical debt. Almost the same exact concept, but for humans, where all of the conversations we should have had about the well-being of our employees, all of the joy at work, the satisfaction, the happiness, the remuneration, whatever else you want to call it, that hasn't been really resolved. All of those things have accumulated into what I call human debt. So when I arrived at this humongous indignation, I started looking more closely into kind of what could be causing this, and where is it that the most amount of knowledge on how to resolve this would be. And I was surprised to see what seemed to me to be two different distinct communities. And I think anyone that's interested in these topics would have noticed this. So if you even look at LinkedIn these days, forget any other place, you see that there is an HR community, quote unquote, although obviously it has many people from other parts of the organization. And then there is an agile community or a DevOps community, right? Although obviously that too has thankfully some intersection with the other bits of the organization. But even then, the two types of discourse are extremely separate.
Yeah.
And also, equally, if you look more in depth, one of these two parts seems to be the holders of culture and the ones that understand the most what it takes for people to be efficient in an agile world. And unfortunately for us all, it isn't the people always that we are paying to be taking care of this, meaning the HR, but rather the DevOps community. So when I've noticed this, I just thought this cannot do. We can't possibly be hoping to steer big organizations or create new startups or kind of move around in a world where there is this disconnect and this big gap between them. And this is the root of why we have this human debt.
So how has the global pandemic affected this phenomenon?
Gosh, how has the global pandemic affected us all? I feel like we still don't have an answer. Every day that passes seems like it has more studies and more statistics and less of answers. But I
Yeah.
think what we have seen, and I think we've talked about this before, which is kind of sad that it's the same situation in a way. What we have seen is at first an instant amount of huge openness, if you wish, to the topics about people and humanity at work. And I feel over the last few months that window is closing and that rhetoric is changing. So the pandemic in itself has opened us to these topics and has meant that more bridges were being built between these two communities.
Yeah.
So, in other words, ways in which to make teams effective, the topics of psychological safety, which is the central topic between the two of them, the topic of how do we interject enough joy in people's lives at work, how do we make sure that work is flexible and human and stops with the delimitation between our personal lives and our work lives and all that. All of those topics were up in the air, discussed at large by the two communities. So it seemed like that some bridge was being built, except when that conversation turned from a theoretical and enthusiastic movement between the two bits and then turned into policies being made and old school execs going back to the office and demanding that everyone shows up. When all
Right.
of those things started happening, that's when we're seeing in some places that the window of the open communication that was so constructive and so needed, and it was doing away with human death every day, is starting to close. And I fear that if we don't kind of find a way to keep it open, jam it open, we're going to have lost this brilliant moment where essentially the POC of remote work has been proven, and we are moving fast, I think, as a society towards truly flexible work that's around outcomes and truly intelligent work that's around humans and not products only.
I'm wondering if some of this, I mean, depending on who you're reading, it's anywhere between like 70% and 90% of employees are considering other forms of employment right now. I mean, I love this concept of human debt and, and really, especially coming from a technology background and some, that's a meaningful term to me. But, do you think that some of this, at least I don't know if it's actual turnover or just threatened turnover in employment. I mean, do you think that's kind of a reaction to what you're saying, which is there was seeming openness, and now there is some contraction from leadership of like, oh, okay, well, let's just kind of go back to whatever normal was, and do you think that's kind of a almost a rebellion or a reaction to that?
It is, and it's surprising to hear myself saying that because I've spent a good amount of time saying we can't be talking about retention and acquisition, how to get those are old school and already tired HR themes. So I've
Yeah.
spent a long time saying that's irrelevant. It's become relevant right now because the amount of good people that I hear saying, I will not stand for this. I have a newfound respect for what I need to be doing with my life, what my work life needs to look like. And my company knows that I am good for it. If they're going to, in any which way, like force me back into the office or make me stop thinking about these topics that are important in terms of our dynamic in the team and in terms of my self care, if any of these things are going to be taken away from me, then I'm walking. So there's a lot of that. I think, like you're saying, it's a bit of a rebellion, yes, to a degree, but also people have understood that there are practical considerations that have changed. You're a lot more available to the worldwide, and people with good value will then understand how to translate this new changing reality into better offers fast, unless we find a way to keep them by offering the flexibility they're looking for.
So I guess on the flip side of that, in the when there's more positive outcomes, and those organizations that, let's just say, they've learned a bit, and they're open to learning and adapting and reducing that human debt. What can a company, or what should a company be striving for to, as a good outcome in that? And how should they look at that? I mean, obviously they're not going to do it all at once, but how can they look at making incremental steps, and where can they start?
Where to start is always a tough choice, isn't it? I
Yeah.
think the number one place that all organizations have to think of is formulating a stance around what amount of organizational permission they're willing to give these big topics, right?
Yeah.
So essentially, if you have a leadership that's conscious enough about the enormity of the change ahead, then they're going to be forced to think under, wow, these are big topics. Everything's up in the air. We need a tabula rasa type of exercise in terms of what work means. We need to allow individuals and teams to tell us what they need. We need to understand how that fits with what we're meant to be making, what outcomes based work is like, what is individual work, what is group work, where this work takes place, if ever. We need to discuss where it is. All of those big themes have to be up in the air. But more importantly, to do that, we have to enable them to talk about and mean very human topics, which is a huge shift in thinking from any other conversation that we've ever had in the workplace, where we were expected to have no emotions and be a little robot. So, what we need organizations to do is to say, right, this is the time where you can have a completely honest and human conversation, where we need to hear how you really feel and how you really think. And you have our full support in terms of resources, in terms of ideology, whatever it is that you need to be doing these conversations. So what I call organizational permission. So I think anyone who's serious about working on this human debt has to give organizational permission to work on these human topics to their people. And then their people are going to be smart enough to arrive at the more practical things, right? Because then a step lower, if you wish, or a step more important, not lower, at the team level, when team realized that this is a serious movement, we are now at a time where work is changing and we are expected to work on ourselves and our team. When that human work becomes part of their everyday, and it's the human debt is as important to pay off as the technical debt, and it becomes part of what you're doing instead of just continuously delivering and continuously making new features, then it becomes a sustainable amount of work on the human debt. So making that space, regaining that power, getting that organization permission, using it to carve the time, the space, and the resources to do the human work at the team level, so that you increase your psychological safety, so that you have better communication and collaboration in the team, and so that you as an individual feel better. That's what's going to make a sustainable long-term difference.
So can this start at the team level from your perspective, or does it need leadership to kind of drive it? I know it's always better to have leadership support, but how can it kind of start within organically?
Absolutely. And I've said this over and over again. People don't want to hear that because it's
Yeah.
been 20, 30 years of waiting for someone to come down and fix it and take the
Right.
wheel, and no one has been doing. And a lot of places, and I understand this, we all have this tendency, right? We're all tired, we're all overworked. We would all like for someone to kind of sort some of our problems. Why should we take even more work on? But realistically, a lot can and should be done at the team level, in particular because this organizational permission that I'm talking about, it is for now implied, right? So unless your organization has come down and you're one of the unfortunate people working for JP Morgan who has been told to go back to the office no matter what, and they don't care if you do
Yeah.
or you don't, unless you're in that horrible situation, most likely the organization is implying that they would like you to do this thinking work, and it is open and it is done with your best interest at heart. So as long as that implication exists, even if it isn't the truth, even if it doesn't end up being the policy that they put in place, for now that window of this conversation around the human topics is open, and it can be grabbed at a team level to start putting in place, start pushing back against deadlines that are assassinating your time for doing any of the human work, start putting some human work practices in place in a remote fashion, and kind of taking care of yourself. This is the time to assume that organizational permission and work on your own self.
Yeah, I love that. I agree. I mean, again, I'm a strong advocate for leadership needs to take responsibility for stuff, but at the same time, I completely agree with what you're saying. You can't use that as a crutch or as an excuse to not do things. I mean, there's plenty of, whether you're managing a small team or there's plenty of other opportunities within an organization to do something. And I mean, sometimes even leaders need to see examples of stuff done well, right?
Mhm.
Um,
Yes, and it's, I won't claim this is easy, right? I am perfectly aware, and we work with tens, hundreds of teams, and there is resistance towards the human work at every level. And I'm not even talking about, developers don't want to do the human work. I'm talking about agile coaches don't really want to do it. I'm talking about scrum masters who will shy away at some point. I'm talking about people who are there so that they work on the human work who still find it difficult. And it's very natural and normal because it is a lot more comfortable to be doing the normal delivery and operational work. And this part is the uncomfortable, unpleasant, and grating work. But realistically, we all know on some level that this is the part that matters, that this is the part that's going to carry us. So the work just needs starting, and then it becomes a lot easier once you get the right tools in place, once you get the right practices in place, and once you start seeing results of that hard work. I've seen developers in tears when they realize that some of the actions that they were doing, the human interventions, the workshops, the things that they were doing to better their teams were actually translatable into different behaviors that showed them performance in their code writing practically. So when once people understand that there are ways in which you can better yourself at your own level, you don't have to wait for the white horse of the organization to come upon you and save you. Then things change, and they change fast. But the first initial understanding of that is not an easy mountain to climb.
Well, let's switch gears a little bit here and talk a little bit about your book, People Before Tech. Tell me a little bit about, what would you like people to take away from it as some key takeaways?
Right. So the book is has been written with the hope that it will mend that bridge between the two communities, which means that if you are an HR professional, then the way that I've explained, the human topics, the way that I've explained in particular the dynamic in the teams and psychological safety is possibly not as academically heavy as you'd like it. And on the flip side, if you're an agile or a DevOps person, you're probably going to think it's a little bit of agile for dummies in the tone of the explanation. And that's by design. Both of those sides are going to be unsatisfied, is because I want the other side to completely get it. I think that the need to comprehend how the two things fit together is what's going to bring the right conversation along. As soon as you have leadership and HR and the people, the business people comprehend the need for teams and the need for the dynamic that will enable speed in agile and the need for agile in general, then they're going to start asking the right kind of questions that the DevOps community can answer in terms of what they've seen work in teams and so on. So the main topic there is let's try and bridge this so that we can start doing away with the human debt. And then the second topic, I think that's obviously the biggest one for me because I live and breathe psychological safety, is that psychological safety in teams is an actually definable and then actionable concept. And as soon as you think of it that way, then these two communities can and should come together because it's an easy win that shows performance immediately. So if you want to start nowhere else to kind of get rid of the human debt, you should probably start with measuring and increasing the psychological safety of your teams, because that will give you the type of change within the organization that will kind of jumpstart all of the other topics that we have left in the human debt.
Yeah, and I know we talked about it a bit on the last episode that you were on, but just for those that didn't get the benefit of listening to that, what does psychological safety mean to you, just so everybody can have that definition?
Sure. So psychological safety, and I expect for the record, I was writing about this earlier this week and last week. I expect I'm going to be doing this well into my 80s, but
Right.
that's okay. That's all right. It's necessary. It's not a problem. I've accepted my fate. But psychological safety is a concept that has been studied tens of years ago. It has been discovered by academics, and then it has been studied in depth by a lady by the name of Professor Dr. Amy Edmondson, who is a Harvard professor, who has dedicated her life to the concept and has come up with some amazing books that everyone should read on how to have fearless organizations, on how to do teaming, on how to have high performing organizations and do innovation and collaboration. So she has spent a lot of her time studying the concept of psychological safety. And then the second big moment in the life of the concept has been when a few years ago Google has ran a really comprehensive, maybe the most comprehensive work study in the history of digital enterprises, called Project Aristotle, which was looking at what is it that makes a Google team an awesome team. And despite the fact that they had went through a large set of variables and had interrogated all kinds of data, what they came back to over and over again was the fact that the teams that were high performing were having having first and foremost psychological safety. And finally, the definition that they worked with was it is the feeling that people have that they are safe for taking interpersonal risks, and that they have no need for feeling afraid, that they are open, honest, they run fast, they feel very tight with their team. Essentially, they make magic together. So that type of a feeling when you're in a team that's feeling like it can trust each other, that it can work together, that you're always open with each other, you're authentic, you're never biting your lip, you're never shying away from expressing yourself, be it to admit a fault or to point out something or to ask a question. That team has psychological safety, and if they have psychological safety, then they have high performance. So when these things kind of came together, the results from the project Aristotle that were then reproduced by the Accelerate report that has looked at then 3,600 enterprises and found the exact same findings being reproducible. So they're not a Google thing, and they're not a hospitals thing, as in Amy's research, and they're not a Boeing thing. They're an everywhere thing. Teams that have psychological safety are incredibly more performant simply because they have this sense of ability that they can have no fear and run at the best of their ability. So if you want to change one dynamic, and obviously it's a very big concept that involves a number of other behaviors, if you wish, right? So teams that are psychologically safe, for instance, we make a piece of software that looks at various components of it. And some of those components are the teams are courageous, the teams are flexible, they learn together, they have a great emotional bond, they're open with each other, so they speak up, and they never impression manage. They're not afraid to look a certain way to their peers. So when that happens, that's when you can make magic with your team and be high performing, in particular when it comes to technology and agile teams.
Just as a fellow author, I always like to talk a little bit about the process of writing books. So just, as you were writing people before tech, um, was there anything that you learned about, or changed about your writing process, or did the pandemic affect it? Just like what was the process of writing the book, and what did you learn?
Oh gosh, what have I learned? Always a tough question because I've learned all the things. Everything was new and everything was already kind of slightly known, but not known
Yeah.
enough. But from the perspective of knowledge, obviously you always gather more. But from the perspective of what I've learned about myself, I think that was quite interesting. The number one thing I've learned is that I'm not as superhuman as I thought I were, because
That's a tough realization sometimes. But yeah.
it's a horrible thing, in particular at my age. Like, there's no more time to become a superhuman. So, um, it's not my first book. I wrote a book before, but this time around, I got Bloomsbury has offered me the book contract exactly 3 days before Boris Johnson closed the UK, and we went into our first lockdown. And my first thought was, this is brilliant. It's the right time for me to write a book. But it was just as misinformed as all those people that thought they were going to be playing the banjo or learning Mandarin, because it was not the right time. It was the absolute wrong time. I ended up, this book was written. I woke up every morning at 4:30, wrote for 6 or 7 pomodoros until about 7:30 or so, when I became a primary school teacher, because you had to homeschool, which is
Oh,
something that I suppose did not occur to me until
right.
well into the lockdown. And because my little one is not neurotypical, he would not accept the fact that we would have any flexibility in our school day. So they ran from 8 to 12 or 8 to 1 every day, irrespective of the fact that mom is writing a book and mom is running a company and designing a product.
Right.
So I was a school teacher from 8 or 7:30 until 12 or 1 that day, and only afterwards did I start running a company, making a product. And during the pandemic, that's probably what added to it, is we weren't one of those companies that could kind of take a break and take a breath, because what we were doing was help teams. We opened our software for use for any team that needed it to be helpful during COVID, which meant that we had hundreds of teams come talk to us at the same time. So it was literally the busiest time in the history of the company while I was writing the book and being a primary
Wow.
school teacher, which is what taught me I'm not superhuman, but it was still lovely and I'm glad it's done.
Yeah, yeah. Well, no, congrats on finishing that, and looking forward to reading it. Duena, thanks so much for joining the show. For those listening that want to learn more and keep up with what you're doing, what's the best way to do that?
I think probably the best or the easiest way to do that is unfortunately in some ways I'm all over the internet. So just kind of if you Google Duena Blomstrom, you're going to get a lot. But just going to LinkedIn means that there are two different newsletters. One of them is on Mondays and Tuesdays called Chasing Psychological Safety, and the other one is The Future is Agile on Wednesdays. If you subscribe to those, you're going to get my writing 3 times a week in your inbox. And if not, just kind of drop me a message and let's have a chat and let's start changing the world.
Wonderful. Well, again, I'd like to thank Duena Blomstrom, co-founder and CEO of People Not Tech, for joining the show. Thanks again for listening to The Agile World with Greg Kihlstrom. See you next week. Thanks again for listening to the Agile World podcast, brought to you by Tech Systems. I'm your host, Greg Kihlstrom. If you enjoyed the show, please take a minute to subscribe on your podcast channel of choice and leave us a rating so that others can find the show more easily. You can learn more and get a copy of my latest book, The Agile Workforce, from my website at theagile.world.